Hello and welcome to You Are Not Your Diagnosis. I'm your host, Lynn Del Mastro Thompson, owner of Heartfire Healing. I'm a certified body talk practitioner, intuitive healer, breathwork practitioner, and author of the Amazon bestseller, You Are Not Your Diagnosis. I'm so grateful that you've decided to make time to listen to this show and to learn more about how not to be your diagnosis. Since this is the very first episode of the show, I thought that what I would do today is share a little bit of my own story, how I came to the work that I do, why I'm so passionate about this message, You Are Not Your Diagnosis. And in case you can't tell, I've already written a book on the topic, so I have a lot of things to say about why we are not our diagnosis. And I want to share a little bit more about what to expect moving forward with the episodes of this show, what sorts of things I'll be talking about, and why I'm doing this show to begin with. So let's get started. I want to take you back into my own story. And I want to go back into my 20s, right as I was graduating from college. So when I was graduating from college, I decided that I was going to go to graduate school and pursue a PhD and hopefully teach history at a college level. And looking back on it from what I know now, I think I was really afraid to go out and get a job and to have to be what I perceived as a grown-up. And so at that time, I thought that going to graduate school and pursuing more education was a better option for me. It was less scary. So I started graduate school in the fall of 2001, and I was down in Santa Barbara. And as I started that program, I immediately felt like I wasn't really in the right place. I had friends and colleagues who seemed really happy in the program, to seem to really be thriving and doing well, and I really immediately just didn't feel at home there. I was thrown into being a teaching assistant, and I had no training in how to do that. I was taking classes that didn't really light me up. But I kind of started to brush that off. I thought, well, it'll get better, or graduate school is just not the easiest thing. Like, you loved college, but graduate school is different. And so I continued for a number of years. And over the course of those number of years, my body started to kind of give me some subtle messages confirming that this was really not the right path for me. So when I was a child, I had migraine headaches, and they had kind of pretty much subsided and gone away when I was in college. Well, when I was in graduate school, they started to come back with more frequency and more intensity again. I started to sink into a bit of depression, and I started to feel a lot of anxiety and even experience some panic attacks. And again, all of these things I was brushing off as saying, school is just stressful. Like, graduate school is supposed to be this way. I'm supposed to be stressed out. I'm supposed to just not feel really great. Like, isn't this how it's supposed to be? And there were some discussions in that process of maybe moving to something else, like maybe this isn't the right thing. But whenever I would talk to my parents, and my mom would ask the question, well, what do you want to do? I had no answer to that question. And so I felt like I just would keep going. So that was kind of where I was in the summer of 2004. And in that summer, I had scheduled elective surgery. I was going to have a breast reduction at that time. And so I saw myself as relatively healthy, anxious, not always like emotionally the happiest person, but overall my health was good. And when I went in for the pre-op blood work, as we all have to do when we have surgery, the surgeon called the night before the surgery, and he said, I got your pre-op blood work results back, and there's something that looks abnormal. And I remember that feeling of my heart kind of doing a little bit of a flip-flop and a drop, and like, what's wrong? And he said, now don't panic quite yet. I want you to go back, and we're going to do a retest of the labs. It could be a lab error. Maybe they switched your vial with somebody else's. Let's just make sure that this is indeed the case. So we run back over to the hospital. They run the labs again. And shortly thereafter, I get another phone call from the surgeon saying, yeah, it wasn't a lab error. There's something wrong with you. There's something wrong with your blood. I don't know exactly what it is, but I can't do surgery. So he canceled surgery and he advised me to go see my primary doctor as soon as possible. So I think the next day I called in and got on the schedule to see my primary doctor and start the process of trying to figure out what was wrong. Because at this point, I actually had no physical symptoms of anything. It was just this pre-op blood work that showed something that was abnormal. So after some more blood work that he sent me for, there was another doctor that called me out of the blue. And this was a gastroenterologist. And he called me and said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "Well, other than the fact that I'm kind of freaked out that some doctor that I don't know is calling me and I don't know what that means, I'm fine. I don't have any symptoms." And so he asked me then, he said, "If you don't feel any symptoms, come to the hospital tomorrow, come check in and I'll meet you there." And that was probably one of the longest nights of my life, just not knowing what was going on, what was wrong. Didn't sleep a whole lot. I didn't really know even what to be looking for in terms of symptoms, but I didn't have anything that showed up that night. So I went to the hospital the next morning and checked in and met him. And then it was a whole process really of seeing other specialists, seeing a hematologist who came in and tried to do a bone marrow biopsy. That was a horrifying experience, very, very painful. All of these experiences, and then I was eventually sent after a few days to another major medical center because I was living at the time in a smaller city in California, not with a university-sized medical center, and they kind of had figured out that I had clotted off the veins that drained out of my liver. And of course, that's not supposed to happen. That's not a normal thing, but they weren't really used to dealing with that at the hospital where I was. And so they thought it would be better if I went and got treatment somewhere else. So they sent me up to San Francisco to a hospital there. And this was probably about 5 days into the process. And so I was then at this other hospital where they did more tests and they had to do an actual bone marrow biopsy because I couldn't tolerate the initial one. And they opened back up the veins in my liver. So it was just this whole experience of being in the hospital for, I think it ended up being close to 10 days with tests and poking and prodding. And many of you may recognize your own experience in this of kind of the diagnostic process being long, drawn out, painful. You don't really know where you are in the process. So it was a very, very scary time. I was fortunate that my parents were there with me and supporting me through the process, but I had no idea what was really going on. And then about 2 weeks into this whole experience, one of the doctors who was leading my team at that hospital, he was a hematologist, came in, and I knew that he was going to be kind of delivering the diagnosis, the verdict of why had I clotted off these veins that drained my liver? What was the underlying mechanism for that? And that day will forever stay in my memory. It was the day that my life began to really change in a very profound way. So he came in to the hospital room and he kind of said, "Okay, we found the cause, we found the diagnosis." And at that point, he said that I had chronic myelogenous leukemia. And in that moment, I felt a tremendous amount of emotions just wash over me, primarily fear, but grief, sadness, just shock. Part of the story that I actually haven't really spoken much about yet is that in that moment when he said the word leukemia and I pictured the traditional treatment that I thought I was going to have to go through, which I thought was going to be chemotherapy, I thought that I really wanted to die. Like I didn't want to go through that. I had thoughts that were suicidal that I actually never really spoke out loud to anyone because when the next piece of information came through, that shifted for me. But I had those thoughts initially that this is so scary and I don't want to do this. I don't want to have to go through chemotherapy. But quickly then, after he said the word leukemia, he presented what was going to happen in terms of the treatment. And he said, "You don't have to have chemotherapy. You are instead going to take a new medication that's designed to target the underlying reason why this particular type of leukemia happens, kind of the genetic abnormality." So no chemotherapy for you, just this very expensive new designer medication that targets this. And so that was a little bit of a relief because I didn't have to do chemotherapy. I could just take a medication. So that day was basically like the day that my whole life shifted. And I went from kind of referring to life before the diagnosis to life after the diagnosis. I spent the next probably year and a half trying to kind of put my life back together to figure out where I was going. Like I still kind of tried to keep going through the process of graduate school. I thought that I could just kind of push on because I didn't really still know what I wanted to do, even though it kind of felt like this was maybe a big message. And now I view that time and that diagnosis as what I call my cosmic 2x4 to the side of the head to wake up and realize that this was not what I was supposed to be doing with my life. But I kept going. I was thick-headed and thick-skulled, and I kind of kept pursuing the path half-heartedly because I was also honestly not feeling that well. I started the medication that they had prescribed for me, and that medication had a lot of side effects, a lot of like nausea and difficulty, kind of like you would have if you were going through chemotherapy, but just in a pill. Like I had trouble with, my meals and keeping food down sometimes. It was not very fun during that time period. So going through that process, and I really didn't feel better in that time phase when I started getting treatment. And the doctor, when I would go to see this hematologist for I think they were probably monthly appointments, he was not a great doctor. He didn't really listen to me. I would spend probably an hour in the waiting room, go into his office, and he would spend 5 minutes, if that, with me. He would ask, "How are you feeling?" And I would say, "I still feel horrible. Like I'm exhausted. Like I feel like I had started losing a lot of weight." At that time, people were saying, don't lose more weight. And I was trying not to lose weight at that point, but my body couldn't maintain weight. And he would say, "Oh, well, you look great." And then he would point to the lab results and say, "Everything is looking good." And so I thought, well, everything is looking good. I don't know why I don't feel well. Like something feels kind of off, and this doctor feels off, but I don't know what to do. And I tried at this point, probably several months in, I didn't have the best relationship with this doctor, partly because of the experience I had with him initially in the hospital when he tried to do a bone marrow biopsy and he only used a very local numbing agent, and I was in excruciating pain and he had to stop. So we kind of had a bad history together, and sometimes I tried to say, well, maybe it was just that. Like, I don't like him because that was very traumatic. But ultimately, I knew deep in my gut that this wasn't really the way that a doctor who treats people with cancer should be treating people. Like, he should listen when I say I don't feel well. And I kept trying then to ask my primary doctor for a different referral. And he had actually, the primary doctor had gone to medical school with this hematologist. And so he kept reassuring me, no, he's an excellent doctor. He's the best doctor in town. Like, you should keep seeing him. And I wanted to trust him. And ultimately, too, it was hard to get a referral from somebody who didn't think I needed to see someone else. And I couldn't just walk in and see a different hematologist and have it be covered. I needed the doctor to refer me elsewhere. So it was kind of a process of being stuck in this loop of not feeling well, not being heard by a doctor, wanting a different doctor, but not really being able to get out of that experience. So in the course of this first year and a half then, in the fall of 2005, my best friend actually passed away very, very suddenly. She was my best friend from college, and we were basically like soul sisters. I'm an only child, and I didn't have any sisters or brothers, and she felt like family to me. She passed away because she had her tonsils removed, and she had some complications and ultimately a blood clot. And that whole experience, well, I call the diagnosis in my life kind of the cosmic 2x4. I view that experience of her passing very, very suddenly without me really knowing it was going to happen as kind of the nuclear bomb that completely ripped my life apart. Like, I had tried to patch my life back together, after the summer of 2004, and then kind of within a year and a half, my whole life was just completely shattered into pieces. I was filled with kind of survivor's guilt over why was I still here and she wasn't. It was unbearable to me to be living without a person that I felt so deeply connected to, like she was a soul sister. And so I sunk very, very deep into grief and depression. And I went to a very, very dark place. And this was kind of the lowest point in my whole story. The diagnosis itself was very, very low, but when Jennifer passed, it turned my whole world upside down and ripped it apart. I didn't really know how to keep living. And so I got to the place I was so depressed that I wanted to just let myself waste away. I wasn't actively suicidal. I never would have taken any pills or done anything to physically harm myself in that way. But I stopped taking my medications consistently. I wasn't eating very regularly. Ultimately, I was like laying in bed in the dark a lot of the time, just wishing I would just go away, like I wouldn't be here anymore. And that went on for a couple months, and my parents were very, very concerned about how depressed I had become, and they could sense that I was, very depressed, suicidal. And so in November of 2005, when they had come to visit for Thanksgiving, they finally convinced me that I needed help, that I needed to seek mental help because I was so depressed. And I went into an inpatient program for about 5 days to help me go through a little bit of intensive therapy and get some kind of stabilization from where I was in this very, very dark place of feeling like, how can I keep living? Like, I'm sick. I don't feel well. I just lost one of the most important people in my life, and I don't want to keep living. And what I remember, this was kind of my breakthrough moment in the journey of that 5 days, was I realized that I didn't want to die. I just had no idea how to live anymore. I had no idea how to live with the guilt that I felt that I was still alive and Jen wasn't, and the fear that I felt over my own health issues, and the sadness and the grief over losing someone who was so important, and the sadness and the grief and all of the feelings I felt about my own health. Like, I was literally drowning in an ocean of my own feelings, and I had no skill set to be able to help me get through that, to know how to swim through this vast ocean that I was dropped into the middle of by these two momentous events in my life. And in those 5 days, I realized that, again, I didn't want to die. I just needed help learning how to live. Like, how can I get through these very, very huge, dark experiences? And how can I find a way to live again? And so through that process, and then through intensive therapy afterwards, I was initially going to therapy 3 days a week for a number of months, I began to find my way out of this very dark space. I realized I didn't want to die, and I just needed help in figuring out how to live and how to start to heal emotionally and physically. And so it was a journey that started at the end of 2005, and that ultimately started to bring me into the world of alternative healing. At that time, I started to return to seeing somebody who did something called biofeedback therapy. And I had experienced biofeedback therapy when I was a teenager, and I first got those horrific migraines. And my pediatrician referred me to someone and said, this has helped me with my own migraines. Like, I learned how to control my migraines through this process. And ultimately what biofeedback is they hook you up to sensors that read out different things like your heart rate, your skin temperature, your breathing pattern. And you can learn through the power of your mind to start to regulate those things. So for migraine headaches, the primary focus was raising the temperature in my hands, the skin temperature. And I was quite good at it when I was a teenager, but it never really helped with the headaches because I was too panicked. Well, I went back to biofeedback at the end of 2005, I think, if I remember the timeline correctly, to help me this time more with the anxiety that I was dealing with, and to help me because I was having panic attacks and I wanted to learn to have some control over my body. And it was tremendously helpful. I learned how, by just slowing down my breathing into a very conscious, regulated way, I could calm down my nervous system and I could have more control. And then the therapist that I was seeing 3 times a week said, go to this class called Yoga for Healing. And I said to her, what? Yoga for healing? Like, my exposure to that point was yoga at a gym. And I thought, lady, I'm sick. Like, I don't feel good. I'm fatigued. My body is not in condition to go, do a bunch of things like downward dog and standing on my head. No, thank you. And she said, no, it's different. Please go. Please check it out. And I did. And it changed my life. It was a class where we mostly laid on the floor and did very gentle movements, and we breathed, and she guided us through meditation. And so those 2 things were what I view as kind of an opening to a new world that existed for me, that I could start to have more control over my body and more control over how I felt. And as that door opened and I found these other things, then I started exploring all sorts of other healing modalities. I started going for acupuncture, which I had never experienced before. I started investigating energy work at one point and had a Reiki session that was quite profound. And so it was like I discovered this whole other world, because Western medicine at this point, I was still not feeling physically very well. And part of the reason that I wasn't feeling physically well, that I would come to find out in 2007, was I actually was misdiagnosed. I did not have chronic myelogenous leukemia. The correct diagnosis was something called polycythemia vera, which is a different type of blood disorder. So they had been treating me for something, and they were then looking at blood work for something that didn't really exist in my blood. It was something else that they should have been looking for. So I spent 3 years on a medication that made me sick, that had lots of side effects and wasn't helping for the underlying problem. But in that interim time, from kind of the end of 2005 until I figured out the correct diagnosis, that I had been misdiagnosed, I did start to find some healing and relief through these alternative therapies. I started to feel more in control of my body, like I said, and I started to find things like acupuncture and Chinese herbs did help me to some extent feel better. My body did start to recover some. And then in 2007, when I finally said, I'm out of this graduate program, and I finally made an exit plan, because part of my complication there was I needed health insurance, and student health insurance wasn't considered creditable coverage, so I couldn't just go out and get my own health insurance. I had to find a job with health insurance, so I had insurance. So finally I extricated myself from this school system and needing the insurance, because the last year that was basically, I was hanging on in the program because I just needed the insurance till I figured out my exit route. I stepped out and I got a job and I got health insurance. And immediately, as I got a new primary doctor, I said to her, I do not want to see this hematologist again. I do not like him. I do not feel comfortable with him. Please refer me to someone else. And she said she would. She referred me to a new hematologist who, in that very first appointment, he looked at the stack of notes that I brought in. And that stack of notes was about 3 inches thick. Not notes, records. And he started just kind of flipping through. Obviously, he couldn't read the whole stack. But as he flipped through, he said in that very first appointment, I'm not sure that you have leukemia like they said. And ultimately, after a bit more testing, he confirmed it was not leukemia, that I had been being treated for the wrong thing for 3 years. And as soon as we started changing what I was doing in terms of medications and the therapy that I needed, my body again started healing even more rapidly. I started to recover my health and my well-being because I was actually being, the correct issue was being addressed instead of ignored. So I started to regain weight. I started to have some more energy. I had a little side detour in this time period where I actually had my thyroid removed. So there was a period where I was balancing not being on thyroid medicine yet and really exhausted. But once I got through that part of the journey and I was on the correct medication and correct treatment and knew I didn't have chronic myelogenous leukemia anymore, my life did begin to change. But my life had really changed because I had found this other world of alternative healing. And I always refer to it kind of like there was a side door in the room, like there was this hidden buffet line that I didn't know existed. And once I opened the door and I saw this buffet line of all these things that could help me that no doctor had ever told me about, and I started getting curious and I started exploring them. First of all, I found my passion for it. I realized when I was in a biofeedback session that as I felt better, I wanted to help other people with this tool. And I realized in the therapeutic yoga class, the yoga for healing, that this was something I loved and I wanted to learn how to teach it. And so I found my passion then for helping others with these new tools that I was learning in my journey. And it was basically in that time of 2007 that I found a new path and I started pursuing a degree in psychology, something called somatic psychology, which just means kind of a mind-body approach to psychology. Because I thought if I'm going to work with people, I have a degree in history, actually several degrees in history, doesn't really help me if I'm going to start working with clients. So I started this master's program, which also opened my eyes to so many more possibilities because I had always thought of therapy as one way. And I realized there were all these other ways of doing therapy that included the body, and that was very exciting. So it's been a very long and winding road to finding that passion. But ultimately, when I found it and I realized these things do help in a way that doctors couldn't help me, and they helped my body start to heal more quickly, and I felt better and more empowered, I wanted to share that gift with others. And that was where I decided that I wanted to create my own practice and my own business as my health recovered. Initially, I had to wait until my strength came back, until I started gaining some weight back and I had enough vitality. But now my life is completely different than what it was back in 2004. On a daily basis, I have a lot more energy than I ever dreamed possible. I didn't have a ton of physical symptoms in terms of like pain and things like that. My main symptoms in the initial process were just a pretty bad fatigue and again, losing all of that weight because of probably the medication partly. And so I have recovered my health. Polycythemia vera does have a genetic component, so it's a little bit more complicated in terms of healing and the kind of things that I'll be talking about in future episodes of how we can heal from disease, but my body has healed in amazing ways. My spleen used to be so enlarged that it was down to basically the very top of my pelvis, and now it has shrunk back to almost the point that it is where it should be, kind of tucked up under the rib cage. And it blows my doctor's mind how the work that I do and the work that I receive from colleagues has done that. You know, I've seen the look of perplexed confusion and wonder on her face as she said, "You didn't take that new medication that I was trying to get you to take, which would shrink your spleen, right?" And said, "No, I didn't feel like that was the right thing. I've just been working with my teachers and my colleagues, and that has shrunk my spleen." So I want to come back to the fact that I never thought that this life was going to be possible for me back in 2004. I never thought that I would be able to run a business and help other people. I just thought my life was over and that I was exhausted and that it would just never get any better. In fact, I thought it would probably get worse. And that's not the reality that I live with every day. And I'm also so excited because the work that I do, and I'll share more in future episodes about kind of the body talk part of my story, because that was a later addition to my experience. It didn't come into my life until I think about 6 or 7 years ago. It has, again, completely revolutionized my health and my way of being. And it's tremendously benefited so many clients that I work with chronic illness as well. I've seen basically what doctors would say, it's like, that's a miracle or that's not possible. I see that on a regular basis. I see people going off of medications and having more energy and less symptoms and less pain and having a better quality of life. All of those things are things that are now possible for people when we give our bodies the right tools to heal. So really, I want to spend just a few more moments before we wrap up this episode on just sharing my why for this particular podcast and what you can expect in future episodes. So kind of the core mission of my work is really, we are not our diagnosis. A diagnosis is a label. It's not who we are. And I'm sure I'll probably do a whole episode shortly about what that means, why you are not your diagnosis, and how to reframe that perspective. Because when we're given a big, scary diagnosis, that feels like it does become our identity. And part of the healing process for us really is to shed that. That's not our identity. That's not who we are. But if we attach to it, it's much harder to heal. I want to also talk about how Western medicine isn't the be all and end all. As you can see, I was misdiagnosed and mistreated for the wrong thing for 3 years, and that was at the hands of Western medicine. And ultimately, the message here is that chronic illness, it doesn't mean that it has to be lifelong. I have a very wise colleague who said, chronic illness simply means, and write this down if you need to, chronic illness simply means there isn't a pill or a surgery to fix it. Now, how many other things could exist out there that could help your body heal that are not a pill or surgery? So if you resonate with that kind of message, that it doesn't have to be pills and surgery only, and you want those other approaches, then this is going to be such a great podcast for you to listen to, because that is all about the message that I'm sharing here. So my why for this podcast is really to share my story and my mission on a bigger level, to help others on their journey with chronic illness, because that is where my heart really is. I know this journey because I've lived it and I've walked it. And there are many people out there who might be able to help support you and do wonderful work, but not many of them have had the experience that I have of walking this path and living it on a personal level. So I'm very passionate about helping others because I get what your life is like right now. And I also know the possibilities that exist for you for what your life could be like. And I want you to have hope and shift your mindset from what you've been told by Western medicine and doctors and all of these paradigms to a place of possibility and opening up to a space where your body can heal itself and you can thrive again in your life. So if that's something that you want in your life and you don't know how to get there, that is one of the things that will be a big part of this podcast, is talking about starting to get you to that place. What mindset shifts do you need? What are some of the tools? The format of the show is mostly going to be me sharing my own wisdom and journey and experience, but I will be bringing in some guests on occasion who I feel like have something to contribute to this conversation. People that I've met, maybe other practitioners, maybe other people who've gone through this journey of healing chronic illness themselves, who I really think would benefit you with their message. So I'm excited to continue this process and this journey and share more of my story and my wisdom with you in future episodes. And I thank you for taking the time to listen to this and to listen to my story. My story may resonate with yours in so many ways. I've been told that since I wrote my book, like how many people felt like my story was their story on some level. And so know that I see you and I hear you and I feel the struggle you're going through. And also know that I'm holding that space for you to open up to the possibilities that it doesn't have to be this way, and that you can heal, and that you can ultimately live the life that you want to live, not the life dictated by your diagnosis.